Okay, we will start. It's great to have here Costas Papadopoulos, the head of this European project PURE3D, like you can see on this slide, an infrastructure for the publication and preservation of 3D scholarship. So we have a lot of work and interest in common. They have already done a large study at European level on what are the requirement for such an infrastructure. So there is a lot of work that is done in such a project that can be inspiring for us. So you can do the presentation now. Everyone is here.
Thanks. So good morning, everyone, and well, thank you very much for the invitation. So in this presentation, I would like to share with you, well, essentially some reflections on 3D heritage, discuss the challenges that we have been facing for many years, and explore possible ways forward, particularly in relation to the development of infrastructures. And also in relationship to my current project, PURE3D, and I'll tell you a few more things about that in a while. So almost a year ago, in November 2021, I became quite excited when the European Commission released the recommendation on the development on a common European data space for cultural heritage. I've been working on 3D for about 15 years, particularly on 3D visualization of tangible heritage. And I thought that the recommendations emphasis on 3D digitization could give, let's say, a new life to the use of 3D in archaeology and heritage, which I think has been suffering for a few decades now due to the changes in technology, the absence of standards, particularly when it comes to the digitization, but also archiving, preservation, and presentation of three-dimensional data. But after my initial excitement, I realized that the targets outlined in the recommendation probably are too high. It's mentioned that by 2030, all heritage at risk should be digitized and preserved in 3D, and 50% of the most visited heritage should also be digitized. And I'm starting with this kind of anecdote because I want to share with you my fear, thinking that that's really a lot of 3D. And I'm not sure how we can deal with this before having in place concrete standards. And my fear is that institutions, researchers, amateurs, and so forth will start digitizing. 3D is now easier than ever to produce, but with the absence of standards for the different phases of a digitization or preservation process, I worry that we'll end up with 3D objects of varying quality, without adequate metadata, without adequate paradata, in platforms that are proprietary, and with 3D models that will essentially be treated as works of art. So in other words, without any contextualization that could give meaning and value to both the process and the products of 3D digitization, and therefore enabling their embedding into scholarly arguments and debates. And it is undoubtedly important that the European Commission commissioned the study on the quality of 3D digitization that was published recently. But of course, there's a lot still to be done so as to be able to say that we can really have a common European data space for cultural heritage. Because I think one of the questions is, are such guidelines being followed? How can we ensure that the 3D data that will end up on this common European data space will follow such guidelines? And even if we sort out issues around the standardization of digitization, there are other far more complex issues that we have to face. And a few months ago, I participated in an expert meeting organized by several institutions and projects in the Netherlands. And there we talked about some critical issues when it comes to 3D heritage. The first one is that both technical issues and selection procedures in the process of digitizing and archiving lead essentially to information loss. So like black holes in the universe, there is information that is not visible anymore, yet it still shapes our information space. So how do these holes occur? What is the impact of those holes when information is used or reused or exchanged? can lost information be communicated, or can it be visualized again? Also, 3D models are often created with one particular use or user group in mind, and this has, of course, an impact on the reuse of the archived information in different contexts. So how can we anticipate the reuse of 3D heritage in similar or in different contexts? How can we enable reuse? What forms of data should be archived along with these virtual objects or spaces to facilitate reuse? And even when the reuse of 3D heritage has been anticipated and different standards have been used to ensure a potential reconstruction, particular software or platforms that were used in their making often becomes outdated after the project ends. And sometimes technical issues can be repaired, and therefore virtual objects and virtual spaces can be restored. But oftentimes, such projects are lost essentially forever, at least in their original form. So how can we enable reconstruction processes? What are the standards that we need to adhere to? What information do we need to capture apart from the digital objects themselves to be able to preserve the essence of those objects? And one aspect of virtual object that I think we typically neglect is that they are typically developed with certain interactions in mind. In other words, potential users, they may be researchers, professionals, or the general public, interact in certain ways with these environments. But should these interactions also be preserved? And if this is not possible, how can this be described and communicated so that the original intentions of the creators are clear? And if virtual spaces are reconstructed in new contexts, new ways of interaction may also be required. So how feasible is this, and how should archival practices enable this? And as you can see, the issues that we need to address are very complex and multifaceted, and these are only some of the issues that have to do with archiving. Of course, digitization and presentation, together with standards and infrastructures, present a series of other complex issues that need to be addressed. But my belief is that we cannot move towards a common data space before having, let's say, a theoretical and methodological framework for such a space. So we cannot start talking about standards and metadata schemas before we carefully identify the aims of such an endeavor. Is it to present? Is it to preserve? And maybe it is both. And before starting with development and software engineering, we first need to identify users and needs. And this will allow us to develop an infrastructure that can cater for certain audiences and add value to the digitized material. And in my view, adding value to a 3D object is more important than the 3D object itself. And as a person coming from the humanities, I would argue that the aim is not to develop a replica. And anyway, we cannot really produce replicas because 3D objects lack lots of the qualities of the original. But the aim is to give meaning and value to these 3D objects. So to enable others, researchers, museum professionals, museum visitors, to understand the biography of those objects and their cultural, historical, and social significance. And I think that's where the PURE3D project comes in. PURE3D is an infrastructure project that intends to, let me say, set a new framework, a new paradigm in the field of 3D scholarship by developing an infrastructure, and initially is an infrastructure for the Netherlands because it's funded by a national funding instrument developed particularly to enable the development of infrastructure. But the idea is that it will place emphasis on both the presentation and the preservation of 3D heritage, therefore trying to stimulate 3D-based research and educating a new generation of researchers and professionals in 3D scholarship. So it will do so by establishing a framework in which 3D cultural heritage objects, and I'm using the word objects very broadly, so including artifacts, buildings, landscapes, and so forth, will be published and preserved in the form of what we call a 3D scholarly edition. And let me, give you kind of a disclaimer, is that PURE3D does not pretend to be a messiah that will try to solve all the issues that 3D scholarship has faced in the last 4 decades. I think it's just one more step in this endless ocean of opportunities, but also issues and challenges we face in 3D. So PURE3D builds on a theoretical and methodological framework that approaches 3D by borrowing concepts and practices from the field of scholarly editing. So in traditional scholarly editions, and these come from literary scholarship, the objective of the textual critics work is to provide a better understanding of the creation and historical transmission of the text and the variants of the text. And this understanding may lead to the production of what is called a critical edition, containing therefore a scholarly curated text. So in 3D scholarly editions, the 3D models are becoming part of the scholarly record. So unlike common practice in which 3D scholarship exists in, let's say, a bifurcated information space, where the knowledge generated from the 3D models is published in articles, while the models rarely become available to the scholarly community or to a more general audience in a meaningful, informed, and contextualized manner. So to achieve this, the 3D models essentially become the text of conventional publication paradigms. And this is done by means of contextualization with multiple types of source materials. And this could be annotations, images, video, structured and unstructured data, the documentation of metadata and paradata, so the documentation of the creation process, providing therefore users with access to modeling and interpretative choices, as well as scholarly arguments. Therefore, creating, let's say, a multimodal resource impossible to replicate in print form. And at the same time, emphasis is placed on the preservation, not only of the 3D models, but of all the information associated with those. For example, annotations trying to follow the FAIR principles. So essentially, our three key outcomes in the PURE3D project is to develop an access infrastructure for viewing the models, but also creating these 3D scholarly editions, is a preservation repository for the 3D models and the files associated with the 3D scholarly editions, and also, and probably that's kind of an overarching goal, is to create a conceptual and methodological framework for valorizing, evaluating, and publishing interactive 3D scholarship. And for me, the latter is probably the most important, because what we aim to achieve is adding meaning and value to 3D models, to have essentially the scholarly community appreciate 3D the same way they typically appreciate, or we typically appreciate, use and reference a journal article or a monograph. In other words, to treat 3D as a regular scholarly output. And of course, in order for this to be done, we need mechanisms to evaluate such scholarship, but also to have publishers and academic circles understand the significance of such scholarship. And this is something that we aim to do in the last phase of the PURE3D project. And we have a range of partners to do that. And we started actually with pilot projects. So the development of the infrastructure is informed by 6 pilot projects that are very diverse. So their 3D work ranges from single 3D models to what we would call virtual worlds, and they come from different fields: history, archaeology, architecture, art history, and so forth. And they all have very different use cases in mind. For example, one of our partners, the Dutch Mining Museum, aims for a more public audience, whereas the virtual world we have, which is for the Battle of Mount Street Bridge during the 1916 Irish Easter Rising, aims for a more scholarly audience. So we are also looking at different audiences in the development of the infrastructure. So when we started the project 1.5 years ago, our premise was not to reinvent the wheel. So in the beginning of this process, we conducted an environment scan on 3D web infrastructures, and we did a survey on user requirements, and both are published on the PURE3D website as reports, essentially aiming at seeing what others have done and how PURE3D can build on previous work. So in an environmental scan, for example, we compare 3D viewers based on their features and use the best candidates to experiment with small-scale pilot projects, because our project essentially has three components. It has the viewing of 3D objects, the editing of 3D objects to create the 3D scholarly editions, but also the archiving of 3D objects. Or maybe to use the terms of the Open Archival Information System standards for archiving, we have the submission information package, we have the archiving information package, and we have the dissemination information package. And I'm showing you these, extremely simple notes because that's how we started in our process of developing our ideas for the infrastructure. So essentially, we started from zero, but trying to to be informed about what others have done and what is already up there. And gradually, we started building more detailed wireframes and prototypes for the different aspects of the infrastructure. So a 3D scholarly edition is not about a 3D model online. It has to be written and edited so that the 3D model is contextualized within a scholarly narrative. So how is that done? So currently, there are several 3D viewers that offer users the possibility to add annotations and other content and link it to the 3D models. An example of this is the Smithsonian Voyager, and I saw in an earlier presentation also the use of Smithsonian Voyager. However, even there is potential use. The question is, how can users manage to set up such a viewer? It's not straightforward. But even if the users manage to set up such a viewer, they will not be able to communicate the results to an archive. So it's here where PURE3D steps in to provide a more, let's say, standardized workflow. So we start with a workspace that will allow the authors of 3D editions to upload the 3D model and related materials, view the model in a 3D viewer of choice, and contribute annotations. And I'm using the word annotations in very broad terms, so not only textual. So when they save their work, and then when they save their work, the workspace captures the annotations that have been made in the viewer and stores them alongside the 3D model. So when the edition is completed, a publish action submits the 3D model, the annotations, and the related material as a single dataset to the archive. So here, for example, you see one of our pilot projects. So on the left is the edited mode using the Voyager story developed by Smithsonian, which is one of the 3D viewers that we're integrating into our infrastructure. And on the left, you see the 3D model is being transformed into a 3D scholarly edition, is being enriched by annotations, articles, tours, overlays, metadata. And on the right, you see the viewing mode of a simple article accompanying the 3D model. And a 3D edition is eventually represented as a data set containing a 3D model, related materials, annotations, and metadata. So when this is archived, we need to ensure that the bits and elements of a data set do not become damaged, make the contents of the archive searchable by metadata and full text, put mechanisms in place that warn when essential software tools are at the end of their lifetime, especially the 3D viewers that have been used for editing, let other archives harvest metadata, but also provide persistent identifiers for datasets. And then we end up with the dissemination information package, where users must be able to search and browse the archived editions and their contents and read those editions. And they must be able to view the 3D data in a 3D viewer with all the annotations and related materials accessible. And here you see some early wireframes we developed, showing how whole editions, but also individual components of the editions can be retrieved. So when users want to consult published digital scholarly editions, the repository must allow them to search and browse digital scholarly editions by their metadata, by the textual content of their enrichments, so the content of the annotations, for example, and possibly also by characteristics of the models themselves, so geolocation, quality, number of objects, kind of objects, and so forth. So we're still in the process of developing the backbone of the infrastructure, also dealing with user permissions and user roles. But what we're also working on is the integration of another 3D web viewer and editor that conforms better with our conceptualization of a 3D edition. Because Smithsonian Voyager is a great tool, but works better, we think works better for some more narrative contextualization because of the article format that it uses, whereas our concept of the 3D scholarly edition focuses more on the concept of annotation. And as we did previously, we don't want to kind of reinvent the wheel, but most probably extend an existing viewer, like Atom, for example, developed by CNR, or even Voyager itself. So to accomplish that, we started conducting a few focus groups so as to come up with a series of specifications and wireframes that we can then discuss with the developers of existing 3D viewers. And of course, if you have ideas or suggestions, they're more than welcome. So all this may seem simple and straightforward, but actually they're not. And there are many challenges that need to be solved. And I don't have the time to get into all of those, but I just want to mention very quickly a few. So first is that we cannot build everything from scratch. We have to select building blocks that exist now and compose an infrastructure out of that. But the issue is that whenever we select existing building blocks, we'll face issues that their functionality will not match our desires. And whenever we decide to build something from scratch, we'll face the issue that it takes excessive time and that the maintenance burden will be significantly increased. But one of the, I would say, most critical issues is that the fact that the 3D viewers play a crucial role in editing 3D scholarly editions, for example, by adding annotations. But this means that research data become entangled with the current technology of 3D viewers. And of course, when we're talking about digital preservation, that's a no-no. But there's no alternative. Although what we're trying to achieve in PURE3D is to at least make the annotations of the 3D resources more independent. So to have also annotations not only accessible and readable within a 3D viewer, but also be retrievable and accessible separately. Because what happens if in a few years a web viewing technology does not work anymore? How would we be able to reenact the viewing experience? Is, for example, emulation an option? I would say probably not, because there will be no resources for that. But then shall we preserve the intended interaction and viewing experience using images or using videos? So these are all things that we're still exploring. We're even looking at the electronic literature organization descriptions because they have an interesting way of documenting electronic literature that possibly does not function anymore. So, for example, by also preserving screenshots, videos, descriptions of the interaction, so people, even if they cannot access the original well, in this case, electronic literature anymore, at least are aware of how it functioned and what was the intended interaction. So I will just close here. I think a big question is how might we deal also with black holes of all the material we collect to build a 3D scholarly edition, meaning primary material that we have collected. So think about in archaeology about field notes, images, drawings, and so forth. So should an infrastructure like PURE3D be both the publishers and the archivists? Is it feasible? Or might we think of a traditional archive as a partnering institution that preserves all the files? In other words, to disconnect the publishing from the archival function of the thousands of physical and digital files collected by the projects. So to conclude, developing such an infrastructure is a rather challenging endeavor. And even for an infrastructure such as PURE3D that has a limited scope, which is essentially to present and preserve 3D objects together with the rich scholarly narratives, there are many moving pieces and questions that our field has not managed to resolve, or at least achieve consensus, even after several years or decades of discussions, expert groups, pilots, and projects. So I think questions such as how do we make 3D fair? How do we deal with versioning? How do we deal with changes in 3D viewing technologies? How do we deal with the current absence of modeling and digitization standards? How do we reference 3D models in their content? How do we evaluate 3D scholarship? And I could go on, but my point is that what we really need, particularly when looking at the prospect of a common European data space, is a framework with clear aims, users, use cases, and standards in mind. And in my view, such an infrastructure can be successful only if we develop a theoretical and methodological framework that can do justice to the unbearable complexity of 3D. And I will close with this slide. Of course, PURE3D is not me only. It's a very large relatively large team with several partners, different institutions, and also many anonymous colleagues who have participated to our surveys, also to our advisory board, and therefore. So we have still some time to go. We have almost 2 years left, but we're still in the process of development. So any thoughts, ideas, or suggestions are more than welcome. Thank you.
Okay, so you can hear the applause, I think. Thank you for the presentation. I think we take some question in the room if we have. Yeah, if you don't feel to be confident to ask a question in English, you can ask it in French, and I will translate if some people want. For myself, I have a question about the interoperability of everything that you will create with other infrastructure at national level or European level. What is your PAS guideline for this?
Well, that's indeed tough. I mean, one of the ways we're trying to deal with interoperability. So we're working with 2 big partners in the Netherlands. One is the Humanities Cluster at the National Academy in the Netherlands, and also with Claria, the European infrastructure for digital arts and humanities, but also with DANS, which is the archiving institution in the Netherlands. And the idea is that PURE3D is not developed in isolation. So PURE3D is actually being developed by developers in collaboration with our developers from Maastricht, but is developed within the premises of the Humanities Cluster and Claria, making sure that what they have is to a certain extent, PURE3D aligns with their existing offerings in terms of systems. Yeah, and also DANS is producing actually, so one of their deliverables, apart from helping us think about, again, metadata standards, schemas, and so forth, to be used in the PURE3D infrastructure, they're developing a report on fair 3D data. So I think also issues of interoperability will come up there. I guess then a question is, what about other infrastructures or other systems that are being developed outside of the Netherlands? I think that's maybe a question mark there. I don't think I have a very good answer. We will try, or we're trying to use with to work with established like file formats and systems, using, for example, GLTF for 3D models, that also being used by many repositories, JSON files, and so forth. So we're trying to a certain extent to make sure that there is a certain degree of interoperability, at least within the infrastructures in the Netherlands, but also some infrastructure from outside. But then, of course, the bigger picture on a bigger European level, I think that's something that probably at this moment is beyond the scope of PURE3D.
Perhaps I have a last question, perhaps. Oh. Okay. I have if no one has a question, I will have a last one. it's you talk about the format. Do you impose, you force the user to have a dedicated 3D format for the publication, for the archiving, and if yes, what is your choice, or is more free?
Well, this is something that we still need to figure out. The thing is that because we'll be using, so the 3D viewers that we'll be using, and one of those we know for sure that will be Smithsonian's Voyager, they work with certain formats. So indeed, and they work with GLTF files. That then, you know, when the 3D Scholar edition is being developed, then there's a JSON file that holds all the information together. So in this case, yes, there will be a requirement for users to work with this format. Ideally, to be honest, we will have some ingest function where you know, the model can be fixed and can recognize different file formats. But again, I don't think we have the resources to do that. I mean, you know, that's something, for example, that Sketchfab could be very good at. But of course, you know, we're not a commercial platform, so resources is always an issue. So yeah, I think the idea is that people will be working with those formats. But also what we're trying to do, and that's the reason why we want to integrate more than one web viewer, 2 or possibly 3, is because we want to kind of create an infrastructure that is to a certain extent agnostic of the viewing technology, of the 3D viewing technology. And that's why we're trying to separate all the information that comes through the web viewer or the web editor. So for example, when you do annotations, you will be able to store the annotations regardless of your web viewer. And in the future, if the web viewer is not supported anymore, is not working anymore, or there's an update, then you will still be able to access the content. So we're trying somehow to compensate, I think, for these restrictions that I would say necessarily be imposed by the 3D viewers themselves.
Okay, thanks a lot for your presentation, for your question, and for your time. It's great to see that we have some common past and common reflections, and I hope that we will work together in the future. And
yes, thank you very much.
It was